Thank you all for having me tonight. I am very excited to be talking a little bit about the Russian composer Tchaikovsky. You know, it was kind of a gamble when I chose this topic because we weren't exactly sure what the next season was going to be. I had, you know, a hope that we would be able to reprogram Queen of Spades. And thankfully, at the moment, you know, we're still crossing our fingers, but it looks like we're planning on performing that next summer for our DMMO premiere of that amazing work. All right, let's dive right in. So, Peter Tchaikovsky, the Russian romantic. Tchaikovsky is a giant in the pantheon of 19th century composers, and to this day, he continues to enthrall audiences. From the Nutcracker, which is perhaps the most popular ballet currently in the repertoire, to his Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, to his operas Eugene Onegin and The Queen of Spades, to the Symphonie Pathétique and the always rousing, cannon-blasting 1812 Overture. The works of this prolific and beloved composer are perennial favorites. But how did Tchaikovsky become the household name he is today? Let's take a look into his earliest years and learn a little bit more about this fascinating composer. Uh-oh. And slideshow. There we go. Okay. So the early years. Pyotr Tchaikovsky was born on May 7th, 1840 in Votkinsk, a small mining town in present-day Udmurtia, to Ilya Tchaikovsky, who was a lieutenant colonel and an engineer in the Department of Mines, and his mother, Alexandra Andreevna. Apologies for my terrible pronunciation. His family had a long history of military service, with his great-grandfather actually serving under Peter the Great at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. Now, Peter was the second of 6 surviving children of Ilya and Alexandra. Now, Alexandra was actually the second of Ilya's 3 wives, so the young Peter grew up with a good number of half-siblings as well to his 5 other siblings. You can see most of the family in the picture to the right. Peter is the young boy on the left, arm on his mother, Alexandra. His younger sister, another Alexandra, is crouching below. His half-sister, Zenaida, is right above. And then you see his older brother, Nikolai, his younger brother, Hippolyte, and his father, Ilya. Now, not yet in this picture are his younger twin brothers, Anatoly and Modest, who would be born 2 years later. Now, as a child, Tchaikovsky was quite precocious. Through the assistance of his nanny, he was fluent in German and French by the age of 6, as his mother had French and German heritage on her father's side, hence the desire for Tchaikovsky to learn those 2 languages. Now, he was also a gifted writer quite early on and would write texts in French based on secular and metaphysical topics ranging from patriotism to prayers to philosophy to historical figures such as Joan of Arc. Now, both of his parents also had some musical training, so they had the young Peter begin piano lessons around the age of 5, where he was introduced to the Polish composer Frédéric Chopin, and specifically his mazurkas. Now, here's a slide of Tchaikovsky's birthplace in Votkinsk, which has now been turned into a museum. And now it was while in this home that Tchaikovsky practiced his piano pieces on his family's orchestrion, which is a rather unusual musical instrument. Now, the orchestrion is a musical machine that plays music and is designed to sound like an orchestra or a band. Orchestrions were typically operated by means of a large pinned cylinder or by a music roll. The sound is usually produced by pipes, though they will be voiced differently from those found in the pipe organ. Most orchestrions from that time also contained a piano as well, and which the Tchaikovsky family's orchestrion did. And so Tchaikovsky grew up practicing on his family's orchestrion and listened to it play musical excerpts of Mozart, Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini. Now, because this is such a fun, unusual instrument, I think I've included a video example here, potentially. Let's see if I can get it to play. Now, sadly, I couldn't find one that performed a Tchaikovsky piece, But here's one featuring music from French composer Saint-Saëns and his Danse Macabre. Okay, could everyone hear that? Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure that the sound was working. Now, as a side note, if anyone ever has a desire to see an orchestrion in person, I'd highly recommend a visit to the National Music Museum in Vermilion, South Dakota. That's where I went to college, where they have some orchestrions and lots of other instruments. A really fascinating museum. Okay, moving on. Now, after 8 years of stability in his hometown, Tchaikovsky's father resigns his post due to financial troubles, and the family embarks on 4 years of seemingly endless travel. First, the family moves over 1,200 kilometers to Moscow in October of 1848, where the family has an exceedingly unpleasant stay. In the midst of a cholera outbreak, both Peter and his brother Nikolai fall ill with a different disease, measles. Now, the recovery for the brother was quite quick. However, poor Peter did not fully recover until June of 1849. After coming up short on finding a new job, the father takes the family to the capital city of St. Petersburg, about 700 kilometers northwest of Moscow. And this was in the December of 1848, while young Peter was still very ill. But after his recovery, the family then picks up again and moves a third time, this time back out east to a small rural community called Alapevsk, which is some 2,300 kilometers to the east, where Ilya has secured a position as a manager of an ironworks. Now, the moving saga continues when the young Peter and his mother travel alone back to St. Petersburg, where he will enroll in the famous School of Jurisprudence with the hopes of going into law someday. And so thus begins his 9 years at the St. Petersburg Imperial School of Jurisprudence, which is the most prestigious school for boys in St. Petersburg at the time, which was also the capital of the Russian Empire. Now, Peter spent 9 years studying at the Imperial School, and he excelled in his classes, consistently scoring in the top 10%, though with one exception. His brother Modest would say, "All would have been well were it not for mathematics." But Peter was a really wonderful student, and one of his classmates observed later in life that, as a student, he always was without textbooks. And that was because he and his friend would study together with their books in the summer gardens, where they would then stash away their books in a tree trunk to avoid having to carry them back and forth. Now, unfortunately, tragedy would strike the family in 1854 with the unexpected death of his mother, Alexandra, who passed away on June 13th from cholera. Her passing had a profound, devastating impact on the family, but especially on the young Tchaikovsky, who had been close with her. Up until her passing, whenever Tchaikovsky sat at the family's orchestrion, he would spend hours improvising new tunes, but he would never actually put pen to paper and write them down. Now, this all changed after his mother's death, and we see some of his earliest compositions during the time. And one of his first ones, he wrote an expromptum, a short song, and then he also wrote an opera entitled Hyperbole that same year. The libretto actually still exists for that opera, but the music sadly has been lost. And now, upon his graduation from the School of Jurisprudence in May of 1859, Tchaikovsky, and you can see him there up on the top left, began working as a clerk in the Ministry of Justice. He was a diligent worker and was promoted twice within the first 9 months. Now, in his first 2 years, he handled some 265 cases, reviewing complaints at a petitions desk. However, for him, the work grew dull and repetitive, and he found his thoughts frequently returning to music during his 4 years at the ministry. In a letter on March 10th of 1861, Peter wrote, "Papa claims that it is still not too late to become an artist. If that were so, it would be excellent. But the fact is, if there is talent in me, it is now probably impossible to develop. They have made me a bureaucrat, and a poor one at that. I try as much as possible to improve myself, take my service work ever more seriously, and suddenly study general bass at the same time." So, as we know, this desire to study music was still very much alive. I find this passage also very telling, because you start to see self-doubt already creeping in, an unfortunate trait that would continue to grow and plague Tchaikovsky throughout his life. Now, on August 22nd of that year, Tchaikovsky petitioned to enroll in the newly founded St. Petersburg Conservatory, which at the time was under the direction of Anton Rubinstein, and you can see him there on the right in that lower picture, next to his brother, Nikolai. Now, 7 months later, in April of 1863, Tchaikovsky resigned officially from the ministry to fully dedicate himself to music. And while he was in the music school, he was, of course, once again, a dedicated student, excelling in all of his classes and learning multiple musical instruments, including piano, flute, organ, as well as studying counterpoint and form, instrumentation, and free composition. Now, as a theory student, he had to conduct as well, which prompted a rather strange performance anxiety. A friend and fellow student recalled, standing on the stage awoke in Tchaikovsky such an enormous fright that it seemed the whole time that his head would come off from his shoulders. In anticipation of such a catastrophe, he would hold the baton in his right hand, and then he would firmly hold his chin with his left hand to keep it from flying off. And apparently this is a true story, and that happened throughout most of his life, and he avoided conducting because of that. Now, during his 3 years at the conservatory, Tchaikovsky composed some 700 pages of music. And it was in September of 1865, the conservatory director's brother, Nikolai, there on the left in that picture, visited the school to recruit a theory teacher for his music classes down in Moscow as part of the Russian Musical Society. Now, Tchaikovsky was approached, and though he initially balked at the miserly pay, he nevertheless accepted the position and departed for Moscow and for a new chapter in his life after he graduated. Now, his first years in Moscow, he arrived January 6th, 1866, to teach theory for the Russian Musical Society, which would eventually become the Moscow Conservatory. Now, the theory class that he taught met Tuesdays and Fridays at 11 a.m. and cost 3 rubles a month. Apparently, he was frustrated at his first lecture, but it still turned out well nonetheless. Now, during his first few months in Moscow, Tchaikovsky set out to get his music performed professionally. And his professional debut occurred shortly thereafter on March 4th, 1866, with his overture in F, and that was performed under the baton of Rubinstein. Now, while the press was not present for the performance, the piece attracted the notice of several prominent Moscow musicians, helping Tchaikovsky gain a foothold in the city's music scene. Now, after the success of his debut, Tchaikovsky began work on his first symphony and his first full opera, the Voyevoda. Now, during this time, Tchaikovsky also learned a valuable lesson. Here's an excerpt from one of his letters that he wrote at the time. Quote, "I have already begun to orchestrate the symphony. I am in perfect health. Only the last few days I have not slept at night, for I was working for a long time, and then attacks tormented me." By the end of July, he was, quote, "a step away from madness, suffering from hallucinations and physical numbness in his extremities." As a result, he did not finish the symphony for some time, and, lesson learned, he never again composed at night. Now, in 1867, the 27-year-old Tchaikovsky meets the prominent French composer Hector Berlioz on a visit to Moscow for a concert, which was profoundly impactful for him. And then in 1868, Tchaikovsky finishes work on his opera and enters a fascinating and at times tumultuous relationship with the infamous Mighty Handful. Now, the Mighty Handful, this is a group of 5 Russian composers led by the composer Mili Balakirev, who is the leader of the group. The group also included Borodin. You can see him there on the top left. There's Balakirev in the center, Cesar Cui on the right, and then on the bottom row, two of the more well-known ones, Modest Mussorgsky and then Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Now, these were known as the Five, the Mighty Five, the Russian Five, the New Russian School. And this, as I said, was a group of 5 prominent Russian composers, and they were dedicated to creating and advancing a distinct Russian sound, and they rejected Western musical practices. And now the interesting thing is Tchaikovsky, obviously studying at the St. Petersburg Conservatory under Rubinstein, Anton and Nikolai Rubinstein, who both had studied in the Western tradition. And so they rejected some of Tchaikovsky's earlier work, and it kind of set up an interesting battle between these two factions. And so then we ended up with Tchaikovsky versus the Mighty Handful. Now, Tchaikovsky, he embraced like the conservatory education. He studied and embraced Western musical traditions. As I said, he trained learning compositional techniques developed by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. But he also incorporated Russian folk music into his compositions, but all within the Western musical aesthetic. And he considered the music of the Five, the Mighty Handful, to be coarse and unrefined, and took pains to ensure his musical independence from them. Whereas the Mighty Handful considered themselves the nationalists, as they eschewed Western music education and traditions. None of them had any formal training, actually. And they opposed the Rubinstein brothers and their conservatories in St. Petersburg and Moscow. They considered academicism a threat to musical imagination and wanted a distinctly Russian style of music rather than the one that imitated older European traditions. And then they used, just like Tchaikovsky, they used melodic, harmonic, tonal, and rhythmic properties of Russian folk songs in their works. Now here's kind of a fun piece of art that I found, a sketch of Tchaikovsky there in the front with the Mighty Handful, all 5 of them behind, which I kind of enjoyed. Okay, so now we'll move on to some of his early setbacks and first international premiere. Now, Tchaikovsky completed 3 major works in 1869, his opera, The Voyevoda, another opera, Undine, and then a piece called Fatum, an orchestral piece. All 3 received mixed reviews at their premieres, leading Tchaikovsky to famously burn all 3 scores within the next few years, though he, after saving and reusing some of the best musical selections in later pieces. And then 1869 and 70 became a pivotal year for the 29-year-old composer. It was at this moment he relinquished his dependence on critique from the musical elite in St. Petersburg. He had no further need of Anton Rubinstein's approbation and required nobody's tutelage. He had truly become a Muscovite. And it was at this time a friend and colleague, Hermann Laroche, who wrote to Tchaikovsky, this was actually after his 1865 graduation, when he said, "Your work will begin perhaps only in 5 years, but these mature classical compositions will surpass everything we have had since Glinka." And now this is interesting because after these 3 pieces in 1870, that would be the 5th year after his graduation. And so on that 5th year, Tchaikovsky would begin work on his first major success, a piece that is still in the standard repertoire to this day. And that piece is his orchestral piece, Romeo and Juliet. Now, this piece was first performed, his first composition to be published and performed outside of Russia. It was performed in Vienna, actually, by the Vienna Philharmonic in the 1870s. And it was actually Balakirev who was the one to suggest Tchaikovsky write a piece based on Shakespeare's love story. Now, the 2 composers corresponded frequently during the composition of the piece, which is also dedicated to Balakirev. Now, interestingly, Balakirev was the only man who ever persuaded Tchaikovsky to rewrite a work several times, and his quite extraordinary catalytic power is forcefully demonstrated in Romeo and Juliet, which proved to be his first masterpiece. Now, I thought I'd just play a little musical example. This is the famous love theme from Romeo and Juliet, and I know that if you can't recall it right now, you will recognize it almost immediately. So just enjoy this really gorgeous moment. going to move on. Let's see, now we'll go to the next slide. And now in this next period, we see Tchaikovsky go through a period of high nationalism where he focuses heavily on incorporating Russian folk tunes into his compositions. And then we also see him turn into a budding opera composer with 3 operas composed and a lot of song repertoire composed. The Voyevoda, his first opera, his second opera, the Oprichnik, and then another opera, Beluka the Smith. And then I just thought I would play a little excerpt so you can kind of hear some of those Russian folk tunes. And this would be from his opera, the Oprichnik, which also you see there on the right, the original set design for that opera. As you can hear in this example, one thing that Tchaikovsky kind of revolutionized with the orchestra, with orchestral writing, was in previous years, or with previous composers like Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, there's a lot of a reliance on the strings to convey and introduce new themes, new melodic material. And Tchaikovsky decided to start utilizing some other of the sections of the orchestra. And you really start to hear him experimenting and letting the woodwinds, letting oboes, letting brass start to introduce some new thematic material. And especially with this, you heard a lot of heavy on the woodwinds. And so that's something, and that's, you'll want to start an interesting thing to note for that, and you'll hear him continue that in the future. Now this is when we see Tchaikovsky start to experiment with new musical forms, like his first essays in composing for solo instrument and orchestra. And it's in this period where we hear his first piano concerto, which also utilizes Ukrainian folk tunes in the finale. And then we also hear his first ballet, Swan Lake. Now, Swan Lake, as I said, was his first foray into the ballet. And several years earlier, he had written a petite ballet, also called Swan Lake, for his nieces and nephews. And that was his starting point for this. He used those succinct musical ideas and reworked them into the masterpiece we all know and love today. Now, you'll see actually there on the left, the ballerina who performed the lead role of Odette in Swan Lake at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. Now, one thing that I think it's important to note, the piece actually received some negative reviews, but I think a lot of that was because of the state of ballet in Moscow during this period. Now, at the time, ballet was really the most degraded of the state companies and would be subject in a few years to an administrative reform, which would nearly kill it. So it comes as no surprise the reaction to Swan Lake was not initially positive. And due to the rarity of new ballet in Moscow, the assignment of the company's second ballerina, that's the one pictured, in the main role, and allowing such a complex score only got 2 orchestral rehearsals, speak to the official early disregard for the art form. Now, additionally, the director of the piece also interpolated music from another composer into the ballet because he deemed some of Tchaikovsky's numbers, quote, undanceable. Now, however inauspicious the premiere may have been, Tchaikovsky's intricate, beautiful music began a much needed process of reform for ballet in Moscow that would take about 13 years to complete before his triumphant return to the ballet with Sleeping Beauty and the Nutcracker. And now, while Swan Lake was not a popular success during his lifetime, a revival in 1895 brought the ballet the recognition and merit it so rightfully deserved, and that praise has subsequently endured through the years. Now, this is the period where we begin seeing Tchaikovsky to start traveling outside of Russia for the first time. And because of the success of premieres of his Third Symphony and First Piano Concerto, Tchaikovsky then embarks on several trips to Western Europe. And he travels to Paris, where he actually sees a production of Bizet's Carmen for the first time, which would have a profound impact on him. Now, he also ended up traveling to Bayreuth next to attend, as a critic, the first complete staging of The Ring Cycle by Wagner. And now Tchaikovsky did not actually care for the cycle. It was not to his taste, but he understood the importance of it. Now, while he was in Bayreuth, he was warmly received by the composer Franz Liszt, and though Wagner, unfortunately, was unable to see him, so we did not get to meet Wagner while he was there. Another interesting meeting occurred in December of 1876, when writer Leo Tolstoy attended a performance of Tchaikovsky's first string quartet. And it was in the second movement that Tolstoy was moved to tears by the beautiful Andante cantabile. And it was after the performance that Tolstoy spoke with Tchaikovsky and also furnished him with some folk songs to use in future compositions, which Tchaikovsky, of course, promised he would definitely use. So now I just thought we could briefly listen to the opening Andante cantabile from the first string quartet, which brought Tolstoy to tears. Absolutely beautiful piece by Tchaikovsky there. Now, another significant moment during this period was Tchaikovsky's first correspondence with the wealthy widow, Nadezhda von Meck, and she's pictured there on the right. She had heard his orchestral piece, The Tempest, performed and was instantly enamored. She wrote him immediately and requested a small, but handsomely rewarded commission that she gave him for violin and piano arrangements of some of his other smaller pieces. Now, this request and lucrative commission initiated a really extraordinary relationship that was to last for 14 years. And it was unusual in that it was maintained entirely by correspondence. They never actually met face to face, and that was by choice. All personal contact was to be deliberately avoided. Apparently, there were 2 occasions where they very nearly met, but instead they quickly hurried past each other without speaking. And for both Tchaikovsky and von Meck, the other represented more of a kind of a fantasy figure, and they didn't want to spoil that image by meeting in the flesh. Now, over the 14 years, she would actually give him an annual stipend and provided a lot of funding for him that helped him eventually quit teaching in order to just focus entirely on composing. And now we move on to a dark few years in Tchaikovsky's life. In the spring of 1877, while working on his 4th symphony, Tchaikovsky received a written declaration of love from one Antonina Milikova, who claimed she had met him years earlier at the conservatory, though he could not remember her. Further letters followed, including a threat of suicide by Antonina if he would not see her. Now, on June 1st, he paid a visit to her and told her that he just could not love her and told her to stop writing him immediately. However, this rejection was short-lived. At that moment, Tchaikovsky's attention was focused on a new opera that he was composing based on a story by Pushkin. That opera was Eugene Onegin. And in that story, Tchaikovsky recalled the heartless moment when Onegin spurns the young Tatiana. and that moment forced him to reconsider his own rejection of Antonina. As a result, within 1 week of that first meeting, he proposed to Antonina, and they married a month later on July 18th. Now, thus begins his nightmare 3 years. After a few quick family visits, he leaves his new wife in Moscow, pretending to take a cure in the Caucasus for several weeks. The beginning of the conservatory term forces him to return to Moscow and his wife. Now, when he returned, he experienced a state of complete nervous collapse after an attempted suicide. A specialist was called in, and he recommended a complete life change to aid Tchaikovsky's fragile mental state, and a further recommendation that he never see his wife again. Now, at this point, his younger brother, Anatoly, takes him abroad to rest and recover for the rest of the year. And they travel to Switzerland, Paris, Italy, and they don't return until the next year, at which point he has to deal with his wife and he attempts to secure a divorce, a process which would take 3 years and involved, at one point, her moving into a flat directly above his for a time. And she also ended up having an illegitimate child with another man. And that was the act that finally allowed Tchaikovsky to formally request the divorce. But I think it's safe to say that 1877 and 78 were not some of his best years. And as a result, much of his composition suffered during this period, though with a few notable exceptions, which you'll see listed below, including his amazing piano trio, which was dedicated to the memory of Nikolai Rubinstein, who passed away that year, as well as his Eugene Onegin, his 1812 overture, and his piano trio are the most notable of those. Next, he goes on, he has a creative renewal and goes on some foreign tours. As he sheds the unsociability and restlessness that stem from his marriage, a St. Petersburg revival of Eugene Onegin that saw great success bolstered his confidence, and he was also elected head of a Moscow branch of the Russian Musical Society. And in this period, at long last, Tchaikovsky overcomes his long-held fear of conducting. And after being forced to conduct a revival of his opera, Beluga the Smith, as well as an entire concert of his own works, he finally overcomes his nerves. He doesn't have to hold his chin with his left hand anymore. And that emboldens him to embark on his first ever concert tour in 1887, in which he conducts everything. And on this tour, Tchaikovsky actually meets two prominent composers, Johannes Brahms and Edvard Grieg. Now, next up for Tchaikovsky was a visit to the United States. And that was from April 26 through May 21 of 1891. And it was a wild success. He began his visit in New York, where he was met with lavish receptions and suffered from a bit of culture shock. He noted in his journal the ridiculously colossal 13-story buildings, the private baths, hot and cold running water in the hotel rooms, electric and gas lighting, absolutely no candles, etc. Only in Russia, he wrote, would you encounter anything like American hospitality. Now, while he was in New York, he conducted 4 concerts, and he celebrated the opening of the Carnegie Music Hall. And you can see that picture there on the right, which was actually still unfinished at first when he arrived. And he found the U.S. orchestra absolutely splendid. And now, while he was in the U.S., he went to Niagara Falls, which he quoted as saying, the beauty and majesty of the site are truly breathtaking. And then he traveled to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. for several more concerts and soirees. So that was his New York and U.S. tour, which was a wild success. Now, at the insistence of Dr. Michael Patterson, who I spoke with yesterday, I'm going to play a little musical example from the composer's 5th Symphony in E minor, which he composed at this stage in his life. Now, the 5th Symphony was performed first in St. Petersburg at the Mariinsky Theater in 1888, with Tchaikovsky himself conducting. Now, unlike his previous 4 symphonies, the 5th one is a cyclical symphony with a recurring main theme. And so you'll hear that. I'll first play the opening of the first movement. And so you'll hear this theme in the minor first. And now Tchaikovsky uses that theme throughout the symphony, and it returns in the fourth movement, the final movement here, in the major key. Absolutely outstanding. That is just, I'm glad that Michael Patterson suggested that to me. And I listened to that for the first time yesterday and just fell in love with it. Now let us move on. And another major piece, of course, for Tchaikovsky is his ballet, The Sleeping Beauty, which he wrote in 1888 and 1889 and 1890. It's a ballet in 3 acts, his second ballet, and it premiered 15 January 1890 at the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg. It received more favorable accolades than Swan Lake did from the press, but Tchaikovsky never had the luxury of being able to witness his work become an instant success in the theaters outside of Russia, as he died in 1893. But by 1903, The Sleeping Beauty was the second most popular ballet in the repertory of the Imperial Ballet, having been performed 200 times in only 10 years. And now this ballet has also permeated popular culture through the assistance of Walt Disney in 1959 with the popular movie, which actually utilized some of this fantastic music when they worked with the Tchaikovsky estate. And I've included a little scene toward the end of the film. And so in this scene, just quickly listen how Tchaikovsky utilizes the different timbres of the orchestra to create a specific effect on the listener. In particular, listen to how he uses the woodwinds to achieve unique musical colors. Anyway, Tchaikovsky himself rated Sleeping Beauty as one of his finest works, and I agree wholeheartedly. His gift for evoking atmosphere is unparalleled, and the brilliant colors he is able to create from the orchestra is something truly special. Anyway, after the first performance of the Queen of Sleeping Beauty, Tchaikovsky departs for a stay in Florence, Italy, where he begins work on his next opera, The Queen of Spades. Now, The Queen of Spades, an opera in 3 acts based on the 1834 novella of the same name by Pushkin. It was composed in early 1890. Now, Tchaikovsky himself was so bound up with the piece that he completed the full score in a frenzied 44 days, which is, I feel like, has to be a record of some sort. The opera premiered on March 29th of 1890 in St. Petersburg and was an immediate success. Public and critics alike raved, and the success led to 2 new commissions by the Imperial Theater, an opera, which would eventually become Iolanta, his final opera, and a ballet, The Nutcracker. Now, at this point, let's see, oh, wrong one. Now, I thought we would just take a quick listen to the overture. In particular, listen to the wildly different themes and his use of instrumentation and the juxtaposition of brass versus strings, and how they kind of compete against one another. Find that particular section absolutely fascinating. I just feel like the brass, he makes it seems like they're just constantly climbing and getting higher and higher, while the strings keep coming lower and lower, and as if they're descending, but they never quite meet in the middle, do they? I just love that section. And now, of course, I'm going to move on, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end I'd love to talk about our production and how excited I am to produce this amazing work this coming summer. Now, his final years, his last 4 years of life, he becomes an international celebrity after successful tours, world tours, and his operas and his ballets are becoming more well-known, his symphonies. But despite these successes, the final years are marked by a deepening inner gloom as his own mortality becomes his principal philosophical concern. Now, much of this stems from the loss of several close friends and family members, which leads him to rewrite his will for the 3rd time. And he also sees the demise of his relationship with his benefactor, von Meck, after she cuts off his funding, though he no longer needed it at this point. And now it is also during this period his compositional style begins to imply a particular awareness of the imminence of death, which is especially apparent in parts of The Queen of Spades and his 6th Symphony. Now, in an interest of time, I'm going to skip over The Nutcracker, because we all know and love that one, and move on to his final symphony, one of the last pieces that he composed before his death, which premiered on the, October 28th of 1893, and he conducted it himself. This piece is also known as the Pathétique Symphony, and it's his most profoundly, I don't want to say pessimistic, but it's a very dark ending. And he utilizes expressive extremes that they're very great, with dynamic ranges stretching from fortissimo to pianissimo. And Tchaikovsky himself rated the symphony as his most sincere of all of his works. And the premiere was met with great appreciation. And now here, let's just take a quick listen to the final movement of the symphony. You'll hear from the beginning a mixture of intense anguish and sorrow as the strings cry out in pain. It's very visceral and intensely emotional. Here's just a little bit. Well, I hate to cut that off. It just, if you get a chance, listen to that entire final movement of the Sixth Symphony. It's only about 12, 13 minutes long, and it's just absolutely breathtaking. Now, sadly, 9 days after the premiere of his Sixth Symphony, Tchaikovsky unexpectedly passes away in 1893. The grandeur of his funeral was absolutely extraordinary. You can see a picture of it behind there. The funeral was completely paid for by the emperor. It lasted 8 hours and brought together 100,000 mourners. It's this type of funeral was kind of extraordinary. It was a little unheard of. It was even higher than what they would do for a head of state or a head of church. Let alone for a private civilian and a musician. So it's just pretty remarkable. The country loved Tchaikovsky and they mourned his sudden passing. Now his death has been much discussed and debated. There are a couple prevailing theories and there are lots of conspiracies surrounding it. His brother Modeste, they claim that it was a sudden infection of cholera by drinking some unboiled water. Others suggest that he committed suicide by ingesting arsenic. Neither can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. I think I was reading a biography recently, and the biographer just said that, it's maybe something, because we cannot prove either of them, we just may truly never know how Tchaikovsky died at the age of 53. Anyway, so on that note, I think I'm going to try and stop this and stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions. Now, I think everyone is muted, so if you have any questions, just make sure to unmute yourself. I'm happy to talk about our production of Queen of Spades, or there were a lot of things. I skipped over a few things for Tchaikovsky, so I'm happy to talk about whatever. Does anyone have any questions?
Scott?
Yes, Marilu.
Yeah, I don't have a question right now. I really loved your presentation, but I'm really struck by the excerpt that you played for us from the Queen of Spades, how very Tchaikovskyan that sounds. It reminds even of a little passage from the Nutcracker. Am I imagining that?
No, I completely agree. I think and really the Queen of Spades and the Nutcracker were written only 2 years apart. And so a lot of his most famous pieces, like Queen of Spades and Nutcracker, Violante, they were all written within those 3 years, late 1880s and early 1890s, right before his death. But no, I think you're very right. It is very reminiscent of the Nutcracker, especially the rhythmic tools that he uses, I find.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are there one or two pieces that Tchaikovsky wrote that he himself thought were his favorites?
So yes, I think the two that he thought were his favorites, I think he said that the final symphony, the Sixth Symphony, was his most sincere, and I think that was really high up there. I know he was a little disappointed. The public reaction was good and people enjoyed it, but I don't think they showed him as much as he wanted them to. So he wanted it to be a wild success because it was a deeply personal piece that he wrote. And also Sleeping Beauty. I think he considered that to be one of his best works that he ever wrote as well. And now, of course, I just have to say, I hope you all are excited about the Queen of Spades this summer. You know, Michael has assembled an all-star cast with, of course, you saw the picture there of the lovely Joyce Castle, who will be making a role debut, her 140th role debut as the Countess. She's wanted to sing that role for many, many years, and now she finally gets the chance. And of course, we also have the lovely Sarah Gartland, soprano. You all will remember her as our Rusalka. She was also in Wozzeck and Yenufa. She sings the role, the lead soprano role as Lisa. And then we have a tenor, Jonathan Burton. He hasn't been here for a little while. He was last year as the prince in Turandot back in 2017. And he was also in Puccini's The Girl of the Golden West. He was Dick Johnson in 2015, a really gorgeous instrument. And I can't wait to hear John, Sarah, and Joyce, those three powerhouses. And of course, with Maestro Neely leading the DMMO Festival Orchestra. It's just gonna be a musical feast. I can't wait.
Scott, I have another question about the instrument orchestration. No, what did you call it? Orchestrion.
Oh, yes.
Orchestrion. When you played that excerpt and you showed that beautiful instrument from Chicago, it was as if the piano keys were moving. Is that an electronic system, or does a live person have to play that, the keyboard?
You know, that's a good question, Marilu. I think because there was one that we had that I was able to kind of see at the Music Museum in South Dakota, and they have these big rolls that I think actually they touch the strings, and so that it makes the keys physically play. And so just the way that it's built, so they are actually physically playing, which is just absolutely fascinating. It's a feat of mechanical engineering. Those things really are.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And it is interesting to note that there were some biographers that and his own brother, actually, Modeste, in his autobiography, claimed that his parents were incredibly discouraging of them studying music. But actually, at the insistence of one of Tchaikovsky's music teachers, piano teachers early on, they spent a considerable sum of money back then. I think it was like 600 to 800 rubles to have the orchestrion fixed. And so I think from a very early age, both his parents were very supportive of him wanting, continuing and becoming a musician. I know that there was some hesitation from the father after he had spent 9 years at law school of going back, but obviously ultimately the father was very happy and glad that Tchaikovsky went the direction he did, because he became incredibly famous and a huge success.
Scott, I would like to ask, did he ever remarry after that first disastrous marriage?
He did not. It is now Tchaikovsky's his relationships. It's a very interesting, kind of controversial topic. There was a lot of especially from the Soviet Union, the USSR. There was a lot of censoring, and even from his family members of some of his letters and whatnot. And because it's very well documented in his letters that he had had homosexual relationships actually throughout most of his life, but he did attempt several. There were a few short romances as well with women, but I think after that disastrous marriage, I think he basically just decided to give it all up and focus entirely on music and his career.
Very good.
Yeah.
God, thank you so much. This was very interesting and informative, and I loved hearing all of the music, especially at the very end, the last movement of the Sixth Symphony. That was, I love those harmonies. It was so beautiful. I've heard before, but it's wonderful to put it all into context. And then I was so surprised that he wrote the Nutcracker so late in his life. I kept wondering, when is it going to show up? And there it was. I didn't realize he wrote it so late in his life.
Yes. Oh, and I have to say that the Nutcracker, he actually he was not satisfied, and he thought it was one of his weaker ballets, or one of his weaker compositions, which is just fascinating, even though at the time it was very well received. But then sadly, because it was written so late in life, and because, as I said earlier, the state of the ballet in Moscow, in Russia, it wasn't until after he died when it truly became the success that it did for all three of his ballets. So while he did enjoy great success, particularly with his symphonies, his piano concerto, his piano trio, and his operas, the ballets were something he never got to really enjoy, the success of those.